guys. So last time we ended up at me basically arriving in Brazil and having everything stripped away from me, and God basically leading me to walk and to pray after having done so for 5 hours this very first time, which was somewhat foreign to me. And so after deciding to do that, I made a deal with God that he would take me to all of those host cities, and he did. But there were other things that I wanted to do more than just pray. Not that I thought that prayer wasn't enough, but I believe that prayer should be coupled with action. But they were all prayer-based, even the other things that I had thought of doing. One of those was I wanted to know if God wanted me to walk into the favelas, which are slums. Favelas are Brazilian slums known to be some of the most notorious and dangerous in the world. And I also wanted to know if God would have us to pray with people who are being trafficked in the streets, and if God would give us people in each city that we could train young people to reach out to them, that would be willing to reach out to them and go through the training to do so. And God answered in some very interesting ways. With the favela was basically at one point in time, Levi and I were walking through town with a friend of ours that we'd made there in Brazil. And he was very interested in missions, and he felt the church was not being active enough, and he'd always wanted to go into a favela, and he thought it was interesting that we were thinking of going into one. And so after a little outreach that we did together, the three of us, we were walking by a favela, or an alley that led into a favela, and it was nighttime, and I had my camera gear because I had been filming our outreach, and I said, you know what, Levi, I think we've been asking God whether we should do this. Let's go ahead and just do this. And we looked at our friend and said, hey, you're gonna come with us? And he was scared. He said, no, this is not, you can't just walk in anytime you want. Everybody there knows each other. You're gonna stand out immediately, especially as Americans. And it's nighttime and you've got camera gear and all this other stuff. Not that it was heavy camera gear or anything terribly expensive, but more than the usual, and it would definitely make us a bit more of a target. I said, well, Levi, what do you think? He says, well, if God has called us to do this, let's give it a shot. And so we started walking down towards this alley, and there was a guy just standing there, and he noticed us and quickly came over our way and said, hey, what are you guys doing here? And we said, well, we're here to pray. We're here to find out if there's anything that this particular slum is in need of, and if there's some way that we can help. And he looked at us and says, really, that's what you want to do? He says, yeah, that's it. He says, oh yeah, come in. I mean, okay, great, yeah, let me take you to the big boss. And I'm thinking, oh, he's gonna take us to the big boss. Is that like some trafficking leader or mob guy or mafia dude? And so he takes us, and it's the high priest of Candomblé, which is a black magic type of religion, voodoo religion. And we go into his house, and the guy, he's got his pictures of different saints, and he's got some idols and some bottles of alcohol that he's offered to these idols and other things. And he said, listen, you guys are the very first to ever come into this favela and ask for our well-being, for checking out on our welfare. He says, people don't do that. They're afraid of us. They always walk on the other side of the street. They stay on their side, we stay on our side. And you guys are the first. And I just want to let you know that we know that spiritual warfare exists, and we know the darkness. And maybe some of us would choose something else, but we've never been given the opportunity to do so. And now that you guys have come here, you have given us the opportunity to possibly know what the other side is like. And we were dumbfounded that he would say that. And he said, you have full access to my entire community. Whatever it is that you want to do, or wherever it is that you want to go, whoever it is that you want to talk to, go ahead. And we spent hours in that favela at night and meeting people. People were putting away their drugs and putting down their pot and their drinks. And we just had a great time just walking through and meeting everybody. And people were crying as we were leaving, but we said, hey, we'll be back. And it was just an amazing thing how God opens doors to places that nobody in that community would ever have thought of going down that road, quite literally. And so sometimes it takes trusting God, a little bit of courage, and just a desire to do what is right, regardless of what the physical or temporal consequences might be. And I think that God is looking for men and women that are willing to just trust in Him, not be presumptuous, there's a difference, but that are just willing to trust in Him and do what He has called us to do, and that is to reach to the unreached. And so just a little thought to have in your mind there, and definitely a lot of relations to what David was like. And so just keep those in mind as we go through the story of David and the way that he also ministered to those that were in most need, because he realized his own need. Blessings to you guys.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another night of Grounded, a Journey of Faith. You were just listening to the second part of the testimony of Pastor Alex Nicolaescu. What an amazing story. Walking just by faith into a favela. I don't know if you have ever heard of that term before, but as he's explaining, this is a dangerous place where you just don't go. But God allowed him to go in there and to be a blessing. And I believe that a lot of deliverance took place in that particular spot. And all it was just hearing that voice and learning to trust that voice, moving forward and allow God to be God. So what an amazing story. Pastor Alex, it's good to have you with us tonight for our second meeting together. I'm excited. Yeah. I'm excited. I know that you already talked a little bit about what we're going to be talking about this evening. David. I know that for so many people, like David, and especially this story that we're going to touch on, David and Goliath, is kind of like an overdone story. But tonight we're going to look at the background of the life of David. And not just that, we're going to look at the implications within the life of David, who he was and where did he come from, and why is it that he did certain things that perhaps we don't understand quite clear. So I'm excited to talk to you. For those who don't know, Pastor Alex Nicolaescu, he's a pastor in Michigan. We met in my time there at the seminary. He was the youth pastor of the Spanish church that I used to attend, and yeah, such a cool guy. So I'm glad that you accepted this call or this invitation to talk to me again for a second time about the story of David and Goliath. Now, when we go in the story, Pastor Alex, just to give a little bit of background, we go into this story, and I mean, most people that grew up in the church, they grew up with the story of David and Goliath. And I can say, like, my little boy, he's a 3-year-old, he just loves it. I mean, he kind of lives through it. It's kind of scary sometimes because he kind of gets too much into the character, and almost he's blood thirsty, and that's kind of scary. So yeah, but anyways, so most people that grew up in the church know how this story goes, but a lot of people perhaps don't know what is behind this story. And I would like to start this with one verse in particular, and probably we can start with this one verse and then jump back to kind of understand the context of this one verse. And I would like to read from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 55. And it says the following: When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Now, Pastor Alex, this is very intriguing to me. I don't know about you, but this is after David has defeated Goliath that this come into the story. Now, I know this is kind of an awkward way perhaps for some people to begin this story, but I think that this story will give us the platform to understand a little bit more in depth what happened in the story of David and Goliath and all the implications within the story. Let's talk.
Yeah, one of the things that we have to understand is that usually the most repeated stories are the ones that we take the most for granted. And because we take them the most for granted, they're the ones that we look or re-inspect the least, because we assume that we already know them. And that becomes problematic because then we miss over really important details. And you pulled this out, this 1 Samuel 17, verse 55. And it's interesting that Saul would inquire about whose son David is at this juncture in time, because David has already been in his presence. So Abner is his cousin, but also he's the captain of the host, his lead general. And you would assume that anybody who is brought into the presence of the king would have some level of background check. And once again, this is not the first time that David has been in the presence of Saul. At the beginning of chapter 17, after David's anointing in chapter 16, it says that the Spirit of God came upon David and the Spirit of God left Saul, and an evil spirit came upon Saul. And people were looking for some way to alleviate Saul's suffering. And they said, well, let's find a musician. Let's find somebody that can play something that could drive the evil spirits away. And then David's name is brought forth. He's recommended. He's called a bunch of things that we haven't seen yet in the story, like a man of valor and of war and all these kinds of things, which we just haven't witnessed yet. So we just take this individual at their word. And he's brought before the king. And you would assume, I think it would be right to assume that Abner would have checked on who is this guy that is being brought into the presence of the king to drive the evil spirit away. Surely at the very least, he could have asked, what family are you from? To the Jew, that's probably the most important thing. Like, what is your lineage, right? What is your heritage? Who's your father? And so this question, it kind of baffles me. And at the same time, if we read the next verse, it says, and the king said, inquire whose son the boy is, in verse 56. So he sends Abner to ask him again, or to inquire more thoroughly, let's say, whose son David is. And yet in 57, it says, and as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him. So he's in the presence of Abner. They've had time to chat. He brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man?
This
is kind of like, okay, wait, Abner, did you not do your job? Why is Saul asking now again? Well, one thing that I'm going to try to make a case for is that it's within a different context. Okay. And give me just a little bit of time to kind of to show you the different context.
So give me a second. Yeah. I know. I don't want to cut your train of thought, but I just want to understand here because most people would read this story and they just go through it, and perhaps they would just read over this and not even pay attention to this. Right? Mm-hmm. But here you're telling me that Abner, David has already been in the presence of the king to alleviate his pain.
Right.
Because he was a great musician. He was just an awesome player, and he was an awesome poet, as we know, through the Psalms, right?
Yeah, but it goes even beyond that. Like, the king took him and said he made him his armor bearer and he loved him dearly. So
there is a relationship.
There was a relationship there. They're not strangers to each other.
So there is a relationship. Now you are telling me that the general also knows him and he's related to him. And as a general, your job would be to check who goes in and see the king, because you are in charge of protecting the king. So you would actually do a background check before you even take someone into the presence of the king. That's what you're telling me.
Basically. This is, we know that there are assassination attempts on the kings often, and here is the very first king that Israel has, right? They're already in a predicament. They're fighting the Philistines. Just a few years ago, nobody even has a sword within the kingdom of Israel other than Jonathan and Saul. And so you have to understand that there's a lot piled up against them. These guys should be pretty what's the word I'm looking for? Paranoid, right?
Yeah. They should do their job thoroughly, right?
Right.
So, okay, so we have this, and we have this question, who is this guy? Who is his father? We don't know now, which is pretty strange, because again, there is a relationship. There is someone that is related to him as a cousin, right? Like someone that you should know who the father of this guy is. So this is like kind of a nonsense question to ask. So
I mean, yeah. The most important thing, once again, to a Jew is what family you come from. I mean, who are you representing? Right? Are you going to bring shame on the family? Are you going to bring honor to the family? I mean, this is super important, right? You come into the presence of the king, your family should be delighted, right? But for some reason, they don't seem to know who his family is.
So they don't know the origin. This is very strange. So what do you propose?
Okay, well, my proposition is that there are two different contexts in which you would ask this question. And one of the contexts is when you're actually inquiring as to whose family is he really from. And then the other one, when you're offering somebody to be part of yours. And so if we back up to the previous chapter, in 1 Samuel 16, we have the story of Samuel coming to Bethlehem
to anoint
and inquiring for the house of Jesse. And the people are trembling. It says that the elders were fearful when he came to the gate. And they asked him, do you come peaceably? And he says, I'm coming peaceably. I'm coming to offer sacrifice. I want to go to the house of Jesse. He requests that Jesse brings all of his sons before him and that all of them are sanctified. Right? You can't partake of the feast unless you've gone through some ritual purification. They have to be sanctified before they take part of this feast. Now, what is inherent in these feasts is a renewal of not just your loyalty to God, for God being your provider, right? You're not offering just a sacrifice to God, but you take that sacrifice that you've offered to God, but then you offer it to those who have offered their loyalty to you. So Jesse, being a patriarch, he would take, a portion of that and he would offer it to his sons. And we know that 7 of his sons were brought forth, but for some reason, this command that shakes the elders doesn't seem to faze Jesse for some reason when he basically says, bring all of your sons.
Okay. Hold on. So I want to understand this. So here you have Samuel coming to, because God has called him to come to the house of Jesse because he's going to anoint the new king. Now, Saul doesn't know this. Saul has been rejected because we know previously that he has not fulfill or being obedient to what God has called him to do. Period.
Right.
He's kind of doing whatever he wants. He thinks he knows best than what God knows. So here Samuel comes. People are afraid and terrified of Samuel. And they look at Samuel as someone with authority, someone that is to be respected. Yet when Jesse is asked to come to this holy ritual that we'll learn later on, the priests and people that were in charge of the sanctuary, the priest would be the only one that actually ate of the sacrifice, right? So it's something that is very sacred, something that is not to take lightly. And then you have Jesse being asked to bring his whole family, yet even though this is sacred, even though there is a preparation, even though there is something that is not to be taken lightly, he doesn't take one of his sons.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point. The sacrifice is sacred, right? And I think that it's exactly for that reason that he didn't bring David. And what I mean by that is David, he's not. And we're going to jump to those verses real quick, but David is probably most likely not of the same mother as the other 7. He was not conceived in the same way as the other 7. And therefore, because the other 7 were born in the right way to the married mother of Jesse, they can be sanctified. But there's certain people that we know that will always be considered unclean. And so they can't come and partake of the sacrifice because that would be a desecration. And so David is not brought. Jesse's not asked by Samuel. He's commanded by Samuel to bring all of his sons.
Yes.
He's commanded by Samuel to bring all of his sons, and yet he doesn't bring And you can say, hey, that's for embarrassment or whatever, but it could also be because he was obeying the law to a certain extent. There could have been something surrounding David's birth that excluded him from partaking in the promise like the others. And so when we read Psalm 51, right, this is David later in his life. He's repenting from the sin that he's done with Bathsheba. The child is dead, right? He brings his sins before God, and he basically says two things. He says, yes, I was born in sin, but he also says, in iniquity was I conceived.
Yes.
Right? Conception. Right? And the way that it's worded makes it sound like the way that he was brought about was in a sinful manner. Right? This is before he exists. And so how was he conceived in iniquity? He was conceived in an unjust way. And then he finishes his request for repentance by saying that thou mightest be justified when thou judgest. And we're reminded that in relation to the law, when you look at what God couples with his law, is that he forgives and shows mercy to those that love him and keep his commandments, but he visits the iniquity of the fathers onto the third and fourth generations of those that hate him and disobey his commandments. And so here, David recognized that God is justified in saying that because he's committing the exact same parents that his parents were, the exact same sin that his parents were guilty of. And so David is not brought to the feast. And when we begin put the pieces together, it was most likely because his conception was in an immoral fashion, maybe with somebody that Jesse was not married with, maybe with a servant or a slave girl. We don't know. We don't have those details. But despite it, he's not brought at the command of Samuel, and Saul doesn't know who he's from, whose son he is. He knows, I'm sure for 100% he knows he's from the house of Jesse. There's no way he didn't know he was from the house of Jesse, but he didn't know whose son he actually was. So this is kind of the dilemma that we have here.
Now this is very intriguing. This is very interesting because there are some things that do not match in the story, and we are looking at these pieces of why certain things took place. As not bringing him into the supper, into what, the ceremony that Samuel had called them to come. So here it seems that David had been conceived in iniquity, but are there other things that actually testify of this? Like as we look into the story, because some people right now, they may be looking or hearing what we're saying, and it's like, man, you're crazy, right? Because perhaps have never heard of this.
Yeah. And remember that these are things that they don't change doctrinally anything that we believe. These are just pieces that we put together from the story. And there are other instances where we can find this. The more you go into the story, the more that piece fits, right? And so if all you do is focus on that piece in and of itself, you can make a very solid case for it. But the more you look at the story, the more that things are become to fleshed out in his behavior and his interactions and the results of lots of things. All of a sudden, that piece begins to have greater importance to the overall story. And so when we just take, the David and Goliath story, kind of just, that's what mostly of what we know, and his sin with Bathsheba, we know very little, or considerably less about that story than just those two major points. Of course, we're not going to see it. But the more we look into the story, the more that certain things begin to make sense. And I think that as we go a little bit further into it, it's going to start clicking. Because, I could, if you wanted to, we can spend an entire hour and I can give you more evidence for it. But I think that you'll see it. You'll see it when we go just a little bit deeper into the story itself.
Well, I do want to go into the battle a little bit because we're looking at this, again, who is this guy? His father is not bringing him forth when he needs to or where he should have. And then we know the rest of the story, that he's brought forth, like Samuel is looking at all the sons there, and he's pretty impressed with the first one, right? He's pretty impressed. And he's like, this is not. And then, it must be the next one. And then he goes through all the sons, and he's like, no, these are not. So is there anyone else? And then David comes into the picture. But I want to go into the battle. I don't know if you have any comments.
Well, Yeah, the first, we know that there's 7 sons, but what's interesting is the Bible puts things, it mentions things on purpose, right? And it gives us details on purpose. It mentions only the names of the first 3. And the reason why is because in the very next chapter, those are the only 3 we see again. Why? Because those are the only ones that are conscripted into battle. We know that in Jewish history, if you have multiple sons, you cannot send them all to war. And chances are that many of them may have also been too young to be conscripted into the battle. David being the youngest and being the least, he would never be considered for military service. And so this is super important, because who is able to be king? Who is able to be anointed? Those that can actually render military service, because part of your rulership, you are required to be a man of valor, a man with military experience. And David is probably the least on the list to have those qualifications.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So let's go into the battle. So here you find the 3 brothers there. David, we know the story. David has been attending the sheep, right? He's a shepherd. Now this is also very interesting. Why is he attending the sheep when through the story, as we were talking before, we understand that his father had other people that could have been doing that, but here David is almost doing kind of a servant job, right?
He is. It's exactly what he's doing. Is he's doing the servant job. And he arrives at the Elah Valley. His brother confronts him and says, what are you doing here? Who have you left those few sheep with in the wilderness? And we know that he left them with a keeper, but he also left the cart in which he came with a keeper or an attendant. And so this is not like Jesse's got one servant. He at least has 2, but for sure has more. He's not a poor man. He seems to be a pretty significant figure, and he could have easily had David at the feast in the same way that he sends David to the Elah Valley and leaves the sheep with a keeper. So this is not an excuse. There really is some reason that he wasn't there. But now he's tasked with this job, and most likely because he already knows Saul. He's already been in the presence of Saul. And so he's just returning in a way that he would have otherwise.
So he gets to the battle place, and as you're reading the story, something very interesting happens, right? Things are kind of stalled. Nothing's happening. Like the 2 armies are just kind of in the opposite sides, and then you have this giant just boasting and kind of just speaking nonsense against the God of Israel and against the Israelites. I mean, they are all fearful. Nobody wants to go to battle. And here this youngster shows up. He's rejected by his brothers right away. Kind of, what are you doing here? And he wants to go to battle. He wants to go to battle. Let's go into this battle, because so many times people just look, as I said, look at the story and you just read over stuff and it's like, okay, this is just what happens. But let's start taking the story piece by piece for a moment.
So he, David arrives, and I think that one of the reasons that his brothers get angry with him, especially the eldest, Eliab, is because for 40 days they've been there. And they're scared, and they've not been able to do anything against this guy. And here comes like little insignificant David that, nobody pays any mind to. And he's wondering as to why, to the point where he asks the question on 3 different occasions: what shall it be done to the man who kills this giant? What shall it be done to the man who kills this giant? He asks 3 times, and he gets the same answer. And I can imagine that he's a bit perplexed. And immediately this triggers fury in Eliab that he would do that. Why? Because it calls out his own shame. They're all ashamed. They're all embarrassed that they don't have the courage to do what they're supposed to do. And here this insignificant one, which literally that's what the translation says, that when David was called as, here comes the least or the most insignificant one. And here he comes, and he's kind of bringing out the fact that nobody is doing anything, and that's the last thing they want, is to be reminded that they're not doing anything. And they haven't been able to do anything for 40 days.
Now, what is interesting into this story is that by the time that David shows up into the battlefield, he already has been anointed.
Yes.
He already
Yes.
has been anointed. Now,
And for some time, yeah.
Nobody knows this. His family knows this. Samuel knows this, but nobody
Right.
else knows this. This is just kind of on the on under the table. It's just nobody knows it, but he knows.
Yeah. Well, you've brought up some interesting words: family, anointing, and table. Now, the most popular psalm that we know is Psalm 23. It says, "Thou anointest my head in the presence of mine enemies."
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that this is another piece of the puzzle that lets us know that David was anointed in the presence of those that did not want him, his family, right? Because he was anointed at a table. Who was there? His brothers were there, right? And I also want you to think in the back of your mind in how many ways David and Jesus have commonality, because it is profound. It is profound how much David and Jesus have in common. When you look at Jesus' story, Jesus is considered the son of David. And of all people that Jesus could have chosen from, he chose somebody who was probably the most embarrassing of the well-known lineage of the Hebrews, right? You could have chosen Abraham, you could have chosen Daniel, you could have chosen somebody who didn't sin to the extent that David did. But he didn't. This is the son of David, the root and the offspring of David, the government of David, the key of David. There's lots of David, and there's a reason for it. And the reason for it is because David, of all of the people, despite his weaknesses, was not ashamed of God when everybody else was. And so I personally think that Jesus is not ashamed to be the son of David because David was not ashamed to be the son of God. Because when his family rejected him, when his family didn't want him, he had to find refuge in someone else. And who do you think he found refuge in? He found refuge in the only one that was willing to claim him. And I believe that God was willing to claim him. Just look at the lineage of David, right? Rahab, the prostitute, Ruth, the Moabitess, people who were considered rejected, people who were considered cast
the lineage of Jesus, right?
Yeah, these are people who would have been considered as out of the promise, right? You discounted from receiving the inheritance, and yet God brought them in. And I think that this gave David that same level of courage. Well, if they were grafted in, then I can be grafted in. Even if my family rejects me, will you accept me? And I think that this is what separates David from everybody else, because everybody who's at the Elah Valley is fighting for the honor of their family. So if they die, right, then that leaves, oh, my family's not going to have the eldest son anymore. So, maybe I shouldn't risk it. And you have a group of hundreds, if not thousands of guys that are all giving the same excuse. And when everybody gives the same excuse, you can justify yourself. Yeah. And here comes this little boy calling everybody out and saying, who is this guy that's talking about my father? It's interesting that nobody else was offended. Nobody else was offended. But David is offended that somebody would talk about his father that way. And I think that this is all the more reason that David has a closer tie to the father than anybody else, because they all have closer ties with their earthly fathers as opposed to their heavenly father. And so David has more courage because he just can't take it lying down. He's not going to accept somebody saying something against the only one who is actually willing to accept him in this life.
Now that is... This is very interesting what you're talking about, because you're talking about acceptance into the family of God. But here something happened. I mean, David goes there. He feels that, this giant is talking about his father, and he will not take that. He takes the courage and he says, I'm going to fight this. Now, to me, what is amazing is that Saul would allow this kid to go there in the first place, okay? Because there was nobody else. Huh?
I don't know if he thought he would. I think Saul probably thought he was joking, and that's why they gave him his armor and his sword, knowing that he couldn't possibly carry them. He was trying to dissuade him from doing it. He figured this guy was, just some whippersnapper trying to, he was happy. He was happy that somebody was angry, right? And somebody wanted to do something, but at the same time, I don't think he actually thought that David would go through with it. He thought, maybe he'll just be discouraged if I let him know that he can't carry my sword and wear my armor. It's not usable.
Now, what happens in this story, as you said, like perhaps David should have gotten discouraged because he couldn't carry the armor or the sword. But we see here that even though perhaps this was just a joke, nobody actually was willing to stand up. There's
Right.
nobody, not even the king. Not even the king wants to go
Well,
and
the
fight
king-
this
yeah.
giant. So
The king was afraid of losing his position if he couldn't win the battle, and he already was afraid because he was told that he had been abandoned by God, and he's having these torments of spirit possession or harassment, and so he doesn't feel confident he could do it, and the last thing he wants is to send his son Jonathan, because then who's going to inherit his throne? His lineage is going to be gone. So he wants to preserve his throne in any way that he possibly can. And so he's not going to risk it, nor his sons.
So now they allow David, as I would say, the last resource, to go there and get killed. Go and commit suicide kind of thing, right? So they allow David to go there. We know that he grabbed, we call 5 little stones. I was in a archaeology class, and they show you the stones. I don't know if you have ever seen the stones that they used to use for the slingshots. And they're a pretty good size. I don't know if you have ever seen them, but I have held them in my hand, and it's a pretty good size. They're pretty heavy. They can cause a lot of damage. So he grabbed 5 stones. Now, the question that someone asked to me, or I heard this question being asked, to be honest, is if David was so good, because he had a reputation, right? Like the reputation, he goes to the king to say that he can go and kill this giant, and it's like, what gives you the credential? And the credential, we know that it was, I have killed a bear and a lion, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that he was good with the slingshot. And if he was so good, people ask why he needed 5 stones. Now, my answer, to be honest with you, was that maybe he didn't want to be presumptuous about his good aim. And he knew that perhaps he could miss. He wasn't infallible after all. But there is a different story also, isn't it?
Yeah. We don't know. We can try to take as many things as we can with the details that were offered. We find out later that within that same army, within the ranks of the Philistines, Goliath had 4 kinsmen. And it was quite possible that if you kill Goliath, that one of his kinsmen or all of his kinsmen would rush you. And, the numbers coincide. We know that later on, the mighty men of valor, David's men, end up killing these guys, and we get their names in I think it was, I forget, it was in chapter 22, I believe, of First Chronicles. Don't quote me on that, but I forget the chapter. But we get their names, and we know that they were killed. And so my view was that he had enough faith to do this. And I think that he had enough faith to basically take them all out. Or not that he was planning to, but just in case. And, he's already coming to this guy. He's already doing something that nobody else is willing to do. And even when he's accused, like, you're coming to me, with staves and stones, like, am I some dog? And we know that David is not coming in his own strength. He may have given his credentials to Saul, saying, hey, listen, I killed a lion and a bear. But the way that he words it is that God will deliver this Philistine into my hands. So he has confidence not in so much his ability, though I'm sure he does, because he references it, but he has confidence in God's willingness to deliver, because it's his name that's being defied. It is God's name that's being maligned. And God, he's already borne it long for 40 days with his people doing nothing. Surely this can't continue. Surely God is tired of waiting. And I think that this is what David is grabbing a hold of, is that, well, God's not going to take this anymore, and he's going to use me to take these guys out.
Now he does kill Goliath, as we know, and this is the famous story. And what was offered to him? I believe that it was offered to him to join Saul's family.
Yes.
Now this again, going back to chapter 18, right? Who is this guy? Who is the father?
1755.
Yes, 1755. Sorry, 1755. Now Saul offers him to be part of his family, because to the one that killed the giant, it was offered the eldest daughter of Saul.
Yeah.
So here you have, if you kill this guy, you can be part of my family. You can join my family. You can carry my name. You are from the house of Saul. And what happens?
This is the thing. This is why I believe there were two contexts in which you ask this question. Because David was not invited to the feast. There was probably no opportunity for Jesse to ever ask David to be his son, because it was at these feasts that the renewal of covenants or the renewal of allegiances would take place. And so here, the promise has already been made. This is a threat to the kingdom. Whoever gets rid of this guy becomes my son-in-law. Therefore, you can claim immediately sonship from me, because as the king, my word is as good as gold, right? If I were to somehow not keep my promise, then I would lose face. So the last thing I want is to go back on my word, because it's been made public in such a drastic way. I mean, kill this man, right? Because the army has been paralyzed for 40 days. Like, there's no way that people haven't heard of this. Everyone knew about this. And so here he comes before the king, and he's offered three things that he doesn't have. He's offered the daughter, the eldest daughter of the king, which would have put him on equal footing with Jonathan, right? And so if he wanted to grab the kingdom, already knowing that Saul was rejected and that he was anointed, the quickest way would be to go that route, right? We know that he, later on in subsequent chapters, we find out that he behaved himself more prudent. He went in before Israel. He went out before Israel. He came in before Israel. The people loved him, and he just grew in the eyes of all the people. Everybody praised David for all the things that he did. So he could have easily just taken advantage of these things. But going back to the story, he was also offered his family being free, which means no taxation, no conscription, no military conscription, which means that he probably would have received for the first time in his life a thank you from his family, because he set them free from military service and from taxation. And yet they would still receive the same benefits of any other citizen of the kingdom without having to pay. And then the other thing was riches and honor, which is obviously that he doesn't have it. He's taking care of the sheep when everybody else is at the sacrifice, right? This guy doesn't have honor, right? He's not considered to be worth anything to anyone. And he definitely doesn't have riches. And so here are three things that I like to describe as the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These are the three things that we see throughout the Bible multiple times being presented to us. The three things that hit to the root of our desires. And when I think of Jesus, Jesus was not in the Elah Valley, but he was in the wilderness for how long? 40 days.
40 days, yeah.
And he's presented with three temptations, right? Three temptations by a prince, right? The prince of this world comes to him and presents him with three temptations: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And they're things that Jesus wants. Like we somehow assume that, oh, these temptations were easy for Jesus. No, these are the things that Jesus wants the most. You haven't eaten anything for 40 days. You're about to die. All right, eat food, right? I mean,
yeah.
That's the most basic of things. Your family doesn't accept you. Nobody believes in you. Just throw yourself off the temple. Allow the angels to bear you up so that you don't dash your foot against a stone, and everybody will be in awe and they will believe in you. You'll be accepted. Don't you want to be accepted by the people you've come to serve, right? Same thing that David wants. He wants to be accepted. And finally, he's offered the kingdom. And here's David in a position to also be offered the kingdom. And this prince basically says, bow down to me, right? Basically, leave your father and come to me. And I will give you everything that you want. You don't have to die. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to go through all this pain. I'll give you what you want. I'll give you all of the people.
You can go the easy way. You can go
Just
the
go
easy
the
route.
easy route.
Yes.
And here's David being offered these same things by a prince who's been rejected, right? Both Satan and Saul have been rejected. And Jesus knows he's been anointed. David knows he's been anointed. And they both know that if they are to receive the kingdom in this way, it is not legitimate. It will not be the easy route in which they're going to receive the kingdom. They have to do it the right way. And so David could have said, when he was asked by Saul, I am David ben Shaul, or I am David, son of Saul. But he doesn't say that, right? He says, I am David, son of Jesse. Big mistake. Because they know you're from the house of Jesse, but you claiming sonship from Jesse means you've just rejected the king's offer to be son-in-law. And in chapter 18, verse 1, it says, as soon as he has finished speaking, two very different reactions. Saul enslaves him. It says that Saul took him and let him go to his father's house no more. And later on, we find out that there's one point in time where David is not at the feast, and Saul asks Jonathan, where is he? And he says, oh, I let him go back to his father's house for, whatever. And Saul's about to kill Jonathan. He does not want David ever going back to his family, right? And the other reaction, as soon as David finished speaking, is that Jonathan takes off everything that identifies him as a prince and gives it to David. One man recognizes, oh, this is the threat. And the other man recognizes, oh, this is God's anointed, the future. They both recognize it, but they both respond in two very different ways. One in faithfulness and one in fear. And so they both knew. They both had a hunch that this is the man. This is the man that God has appointed. And they feared him. Why? Because even though he was nothing, he was willing to receive nothing. He didn't receive the riches and honor. His family did not become free. And he did not get the eldest daughter. He rejected all of the king's gifts, right? By saying, no, I am not your son.
Now,
he doesn't get any of those things. He doesn't get any of those things. And that would have made the king look bad. But in reality, it was David who said no by saying, I'm not your son.
Now, we are running out of time, but I do want to touch on the last thing here, because as David reject Saul, being from the house of Saul, because he's already been rejected by the Lord, and he has anointed David, right? Now, David doesn't take the easy route. He goes God's way. God will provide. I'm not gonna try to do it my way. I'm gonna allow the Lord to bring this to fulfillment. Now, he begins to be persecuted by Saul. We know this story, but something very interesting happens. As he's being persecuted with Saul, people that are also rejected, they begin to identify with David. And they begin to see perhaps hope in David.
Yes.
Like, I believe about 600 men just start, they unite with David, and they want to fight for David. And these are all the rejected from society.
And they're willing to give their life for David. You look nowhere in the Bible, in the Old Testament, will you find people more loyal to a man than those who are than David's men. Like, you will not find people more courageous, more willing to lay down their life and do everything for their leader than David's men. And there's something about that. Like, where does that come from? Why is that the reason? And I think that David had a lot of damage. He had lots of shortcomings, a lot of hurt in his life. But and we see that coming out, unfortunately, later in his life as well. But for the most part, God covers him. David finds his refuge in God. Just read the Psalms, and you'll see that all the time, David is looking at God as his refuge, as his protection. And that is exactly what all these people who are outcasts find in David. And the only reason that they can find comfort and refuge and understanding and acceptance in David is because David must have found it somewhere first. And he didn't find it in his family, and he didn't find it in the king's family, right? Well, he did find it in Jonathan, but he had it before his relationship with Jonathan. And that was because of his relationship with God. When he comes to the Elah Valley, he says, who is talking bad about my dad? Who is talking bad about my dad? And this is what made David different than everybody else, because he finally, or fully, I would say, accepted being a part of the family of God. People felt more accepted by David than by anybody else. Because when you're a part of your family, it's exclusive. Only family can be part of the family.
Yeah.
But when you're part of the family of God, then it's inclusive. God invites all people to be a part of his family.
Amen.
And I think one of the greatest things is, you know, when I was kind of struggling with identity, because I think many of us do, if not all of us, I'm sure all of us at some level do, some more than others. I struggled with it a whole lot. You know, I was looking through the life of David, and I was looking through those verses that I brought up earlier from Exodus, where you have the commandments coupled with this idea that, you know, God will forgive the merciful and those that keep the commandments, but he'll visit the iniquity of the fathers on the third and fourth generations of those that sin or disobey. And I didn't want to be anything like my parents. I wanted to get away from my parents. And yet, you know, later on as an adult, I realized that I was doing the same stuff I swore I'd never do that my parents did. And I was like, how do I escape this? And I found that answer in Exodus 34. And if I want to not continue the sins of my parents, then what I need is new parents.
New parents, yeah.
That's the only logical conclusion that I could come to. If I want to cease the cycle of sin and this downward spiral, what I need a new family, and that is a family that doesn't sin. And I think that once we realize that, right, many Christians come to the church and they never come to that conclusion. They never feel like they've been adopted, they've been grafted, they're really a part of the family of God. And I think that's where most of our strength comes from, knowing who we are, to who we belong. And David, knowing to who he belongs, is allowing other people to also feel like they belong. Because if you don't know where you belong, you can't make other people feel like they belong. And so this is how David was able to be a refuge, because he found ultimate refuge.
Amen.
And he accepted that. And because he accepted that and he was accepted, he was able to accept others.
And I know.
Yeah.
No, I know. I feel what you're saying, because identity, we have an identity crisis. And as you said it, I mean, the only way that we can be different, like we can break the vicious cycle, because that cycle is just natural. Like, I mean, you don't need to try to be like your parents. It just comes out. I remember like saying the same thing. I don't want to make the same mistakes, things that I hated about my parents, you know, because they were strict or whatever, or harsh. At the time, like, I know that my perception was a little bit messed up also as a kid. Like, we do have a kind of a different way to perceive things that, you know, for example, like parents want to protect you and you see it as just being annoying and wanting to control you and manipulate you or whatever. Like, you see it as restrictions instead of protection. Now that I have kids, I see it different. But I'm still struggling with the same things of, you know, sometimes those things that were imprinted in my life through my relationship with my parents, they just come out naturally, and things that I don't like, things that I dislike. And but when you allow God to be that father, truly, like, your identity just begins to change. You begin to contemplate him, and he begins to produce that transformation that allows you and that gives you the freedom through the Holy Spirit to break that vicious cycle and suddenly be someone different. Break the mold. And you can give your kids a better opportunity. I see that now, like, you know, I can do things better, not because I'm better, but because I know God, and God is allowing me to perceive or to look inside of my own heart and just see the things that are really messed up that need to be surrendered so that I can be more like him, like my Heavenly Father. So what a powerful story, the story of David. For sure, he's not a man without sin. We know that he went through the ups and downs, but we see that he was able to find that identity in God, and we see that at the end of the day, he was able to have that victory, to be able to continue to strive this journey of faith. To those who are looking, we are done with our time, Pastor Alex. Thank you very much for spending this time with us. Thank you for the insights. I really enjoyed that conversation. For those at home, I believe that you can find an identity in God. Today we are looking many places. There are so many people that become role model that we want to be like. But in reality, the only one that can change the vicious circle and can change our lives is God into our lives. And I would like to invite you to ask God to come into your life, to ask God to give you the desire to search for Him, to ask God to take the blindness out of your eyes so that you can see Him as your Father, so that we can take the adoption that He's offering and become part of His family, so that you will allow Him to lead you in this journey of faith, to allow you to experience true freedom. May the Lord bless you. I hope that you have enjoyed this time. I see you next Friday here or another time with Grounded, a journey of faith. May God bless you.